Surgery originated in ancient times not as a science but as a cruel necessity. Deliberate violence against the body often became the only way to tip the scales between life and death toward life. From the very birth of this practice, humanity understood its cost: unbearable pain and deep psychological trauma. Before the era of anesthesia as we know it today, humanity saw the hellish discomfort of surgery as a pressing problem that needed to be solved. In this video we will explore how different eras approach surgical pain and what means of general anesthesia were attempted in ancient times. English writer Fanny Burney knew well what surgical pain was. Her novel Evelina, published in 1778, brought her literary recognition, but the happiness of motherhood later turned into physical suffering. In December 1794, after giving birth of her son Alex, Fanny suffered acute mastitis and complained of unbearable pain. She could not have guessed that 17 years later she would have to endure an even harsher ordeal: a mastectomy, an operation to remove the breast performed without any anesthesia. Her detailed account of the procedure carried out in Paris became a moving and eerily precise testimony of the incredible suffering patients endured in the pre-anesthesia era. In 1811, the verdict of consultation with 3 leading physicians was unanimous: conservative treatment was ineffective, surgical intervention inevitable. One of them, Dr. Rebay, instructed Fanny to cry and scream during the operation, for any attempt to restrain herself would have serious consequences for her health. Later, she would describe her experience as follows. The operation was carried out in defiance of a terror that surpasses all description and the most torturing pain. When the dreadful steel was plunged into the breast, cutting through veins, arteries, flesh, nerves, I needed no injunction not to restrain my cries. I began a scream that lasted unintermittently during the whole time of the incision, and I almost marvel that it rings not in my ears still, so excruciating was the agony. I then felt the knife crackling against the breastbone, scraping it. This performed while I yet remained in utterly speechless torture. I bore it with all courage I could exert, and never moved, nor stopped them, nor resisted, nor remonstrated, nor spoke. When all was done and they lifted me up that I might be put to bed, and then I saw my good Dr. Larry, pale nearly as myself, his face streaked with blood, and its expression depicting grief, apprehension, and almost horror. Lady Burney recovered, but it took a full 6 months before she began to write about her ordeal. I have a headache from going on with the account. I dare not revise, nor read. The recollection is still so painful, she complained in a letter to her elder sister. For surgeons, this experience was almost as dreadful. They had to be quick, decisive, and emotionally detached. The best were considered those who could perform an amputation in mere minutes. Yet even lightning speed could not raise the patient's suffering. In the early 19th century, speed remains the only effective way to reduce operative pain. Moreover, many doctors genuinely believed that pain was a necessary part of healing, a vital stimulant that sustained life function during surgery. In such a paradigm, the idea of deliberately rendering a patient unconscious seemed dangerous and almost criminal. It is hard to believe that in just about 40 years, the students of the surgeons would be saving lives under anesthesia. Truly, the night is darkest before the dawn. Unfortunately, pain was not always considered necessary. Since the earliest times, humans have tried to subdue pain. Our ancient relatives found relief when they immersed an injured limb in the icy water of a lake or stream. Other wounds responded well to the warmth of the sun and later to the heat of campfires or hot ovens. The instinct for self-preservation drew early humans to undergo risky procedures, amputation of gangrenous fingers or limbs, or, for example, trepanations of the skull for cranial injuries. In addition to warding off the spirits of pain with tattoos, amulets, and talismans, primitive healers could well have used physical methods to render a person unconscious. Observing how people lost consciousness during fights due to choking holds, healers may have intentionally compressed the carotid arteries in the neck so that the patient would temporarily lose consciousness during surgery. The term carotid itself comes from the Greek word meaning sleep. Through accidental observations and shamanic experiments, our ancestors also discovered the properties of plants. Thus they gradually learn which one heal, which alter consciousness, and which can kill or sedate. Plants capable of subduing the sharpest pain, particularly during surgical intervention, have always attracted special attention. Even early civilization had fairly complex knowledge, accumulated over thousands of years of observation and practice, about a number of plants of which three stand out: poppy, cannabis, and mandrake. The ancient peoples inhabiting the lands from the Fertile Crescent to the Nile Delta in the 2nd millennium BC cultivated poppies on a large scale. The unripe seed pods were scored, the sap collected, and dried in the sun, thus producing opium. Opium in certain doses or mixed with other substances had a number of effects. It could induce a state of euphoria, which was used in ritual practice, reduce chronic pain, and combat insomnia, making it indispensable in routine medical practice. And most importantly, it made it possible to relieve the most unbearable pain and temporarily switch off consciousness, opening the way to painless surgery and the easing of human suffering. By the end of the 2nd millennium BC, opium had become one of the most valuable goods actively traded by the Phoenicians throughout the Mediterranean. The substance was stored and transported in jars shaped like poppy pods. The scale of trade indicates that opium was well known and actively used in everyday medicine. It is quite possible that throughout antiquity, thanks to it, many complex operations were performed without unbearable pain. In terms of scale of medical use, cannabis could rival opium. Cultivation of this plant began over 10,000 years ago in the Far East. Hemp, which served as a source of food as well as raw material for fabrics, footwear, and paper, eventually began its rapid expansion westward. In the process of the spread, people also discovered the plant's psychoactive properties. At first, these were needed primarily for ritual practices, but later, hemp took its place in Indian medical tradition. One of the most famous Indian surgeons, Sushruta, known for his advanced operations in vision restoration and plastic surgery, left instructions for using a mixture of wine and inhalation of smoldering cannabis smoke to achieve insensitivity to pain. From Central Asia, hemp cultivation spread to Assyria and Egypt, and at the same time, through the Caucasus, reached Europe. Herodotus wrote that the Scythians inhaled cannabis smoke, became excited, and then fell asleep. It is unlikely that such an effect escaped the attention of observant and practical healers. Effects such as pain relief were hardly ignored during arrow extractions or other surgical interventions. Active trade between the Far and Near East, which developed at the end of the 1st millennium BC, contributed not only to the spread of various strains of psychoactive cannabis, but also to the exchange of medical knowledge, particularly about anesthesia, among healers from India to the Mediterranean. The ancient Greek and Roman medical traditions paid special attention to mandrake. Since ancient times, this plant had been surrounded by the legends warning the uninitiated against harvesting it. Supposedly, the scream of the anthropomorphic root pulled from the ground could kill instantly. It is likely that such stories served as a kind of warning. Healers and priests sought to protect unprepared people from contact with extremely poisonous plant. Or perhaps to secure for themselves a monopoly on access to the rare and valuable roots that grew on the rocky slopes of the Mediterranean. The Roman military physician of Greek origin, Dioscorides, describes in detail the preparation of medicines from mandrake in his pharmacopoeia De Materia Medica. In the section dedicated to this plant, he mentions its use for treating ulcers, snake bites, and also for inducing abortion. Dioscorides separately describes the anesthetic properties of mandrake and the method for preparing the medicine. The root bark must be removed, threaded onto a string, and hung for storage. Some boil this bark in wine until only a third of the wine remains. This wine is strained and poured into jugs. 1 small cup of this wine is given to those who cannot sleep, who are seriously wounded, or who need to be anesthetized to be cut or cauterized. The next drink is prepared without boiling. 1 kilogram of bark is placed in 40 liters of sweet wine. 3 cups are given to those who need to be cut or cauterized. They will feel no pain, as they will fall into a death-like sleep. Dioscorides' Pharmacopoeia De Materia Medica remained one of the most authoritative guides on medicinal plants for a millennium and a half. It can be assumed that his recommendation for using mandrake wine for anesthesia during surgery were applied in practice more than once. All the same, it should be noted that the concentration of active substances in plant material is not constant. Therefore, cases where such anesthesia proved either insufficiently effective or deadly were quite possible. In the 19th century, British anesthesiologist Sir Benjamin Richardson prepared mandrake wine according to Dioscorides' recipe and, true to the tradition of the Victorian era, tested its effect on himself. He wrote, "The phenomena repeated themselves with all faithfulness, and there can be no doubt that, in the absence of our now more convenient anesthetics, mandrake remedy may still be used with some measure of efficacy for general anesthesia." Poppy, cannabis, and mandrake were, of course, not the only plants with anesthetic effects that were known. Asian physicians also used henbane, datura, belladonna, and hemlock. Also, pain relief medicines were often complex, that is, mixtures of 2, 3, or 4 of the above-mentioned plants in various combinations and proportions, which, unfortunately, we can no longer recreate. Though the image of a complex decoction for pain appears repeatedly in literature from antiquity to the early modern period. Speaking of complex herbal remedies for general anesthesia, one cannot overlook such a legendary figure as the Chinese surgeon Hua Tuo, which lived in the 2nd century AD. According to several authoritative chronicles, Hua Tuo performed successful operations under general anesthesia using a self-invented remedy, a mixture of herbal extracts which he called mafei-san. According to tradition, Hua Tuo was forced to become the personal physician of the warlord Cao Cao, who ordered two surgeons' execution as soon as he fell out of favor. Before his death, Hua Tuo burned all his notes, and the recipe for mafei-san was irretrievably lost. However, researchers suggest that this remedy may have been a combination of the following plants: mandrake, datura, aconite, rhododendron, angelica dahurica, and jasmine. Plants with pronounced narcotic and sedative effects capable of causing temporary loss of consciousness. A number of scholars believe that the main component in this mixture was indeed cannabis, since the very name of the remedy, mafei-san, contains a morpheme that means both hemp and to lose consciousness. 1,000 years later, Confucian scholars would criticize references to Hua Tuo as mythical. They would claim that in practice, it was impossible to immerse a patient in a death-like sleep without serious consequences for the body. But the image of Hua Tuo did not disappear. In the early 19th century, a Japanese surgeon, inspired by his legend, would accomplish what in the Far East had been considered impossible. In the early Middle Ages, ancient medical manuals became the foundation for medical schools in both the Christian and Islamic worlds. They were actively copied and, over time, supplemented by new authors. Gradually, a large body of literature accumulated based on a single theoretical foundation, and it later became the basis for medical faculties in the newly established European universities. In Europe and the Middle East, standard textbooks were circulated in which opium, mandrake, and the chura were common agents for pain relief and artificial sleep. As in earlier eras, we have no reliable evidence of the successful use of plant-based general anesthetics during surgery in the Middle Ages. At the same time, the fact that remedies for including deep sleep are mentioned in most medical treatises and pharmacological collections suggests that pain relief during surgery remained a pressing issue, and with a certain degree of probability, surgeons could have resorted to these recipes. Literature also supports this. One example is Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the 14th century. On the fourth day, the character Dioneo tells the 10th story, which contains the following passage. It so happened that a doctor named Mazzeo took on the treatment of a patient with a broken leg. After examining him, he informed the relatives. If the decayed bone was not removed, the entire leg would have to be amputated, otherwise the man would die. The relatives agreed to the intervention and entrusted the patient to the master's care. But Mazzeo understood the pain would be unbearable and the patient might interfere with the course of the operation. So, knowing that the procedure was scheduled for the evening, he began already in the morning to distill a special drink, one that would immerse a person in sleep as deep and as long as necessary to complete the task. Starting from the 9th century, some medical treatises began to include recipes and references to a complex preparation known as spongia somnifera, or simply the sleeping sponge. The uniqueness of this method lay in the mode of administration. Whereas previously pain-relieving agents were mostly taken internally as a liquid, the sleeping sponge worked through inhalation. The eminent Italian surgeon Theodoric Borgonani left one of the most detailed descriptions of the sleeping sponge. Nonetheless, he himself noted that he learned about this remedy from his father, the surgeon Hugo Borgonani, and gave no indication that he ever used it personally. Take opium, the juice of unripe mulberries, henbane, the juice of miserian, the juice of mandrake leaves, ivy juice, lettuce seeds, and hemlock. 1 ounce of each. Mix all the ingredients in the copper vessel, then immerse a new sponge into it. Boil it in the sun during the so-called dog days, that is the hottest days, until the mixture evaporates and it fully absorbs into the sponge. When needed, the sponge should be placed in hot water for an hour and then applied to the patient's nostrils, holding it there until they fall asleep. In this state, surgery can be performed. As soon as the operation is completed, another sponge soaked in vinegar should be frequently brought to the patient's nose and they will awaken. The recipe recorded by Theodoric shows a striking similarity to the recipe for a sleeping sponge from the Antidotarium Nicolai, compiled in the 12th century. These texts, in turn, relied on earlier antidotries based on recipes from the Arab medical tradition. Without reliable evidence, it is difficult to say with certainty how often such a method was used. It is possible that Theodoric's father, Hugo, recorded the recipe for his own use. It is also possible that physicians of the time preferred to record in writing the potential possibilities of surgery, rather than actually dare to attempt such risky experiments. However, one cannot rule out another possibility, that the author of this recipe, whoever they were, through numerous trials and errors managed to develop an effective and relatively controlled inhalation anesthesia which, due to its effectiveness, found its way into the pages of medieval textbooks. It is worth noting another feature of medieval medicine. European doctors usually avoided complex surgical interventions, especially for injuries to internal organs such as the bladder or kidneys, which had no visible external signs. Even when they described such operations in detail, mostly based on Arabic sources, they always emphasize the danger and stress the need for prolonged conservative treatment through diet, regimen, and medicines before resorting to the scalpel. Most surgical procedures in the Middle Ages consisted of bloodletting, removal of skin growths, opening boils and abscesses, stitching wounds, as well as treating ulcers and fistulas. These procedures did not require general anesthesia and were performed with minimal intervention. A kind of surgical revolution took place in the 16th century. Professor Andreas Vesalius laid the foundations of modern human anatomy by publishing the textbook De Humani Corporis Fabrica Libris Septem. This work was innovative in every respect. For the first time, the human body ceased to be an abstract receptacle of organs, vessels, and nerves. Instead, it appeared as a clearly defined structure. Surgeons who used precise anatomical knowledge could operate on internal organs with less risk of damaging vital vessels, nerves, or neighboring organs. Enthusiastic physicians not only practiced, they experimented, described operations, and created detailed illustrated manuals for treating hernias, bladder stones, eye diseases, and more. New instruments appeared, allowing more precise and complex manipulations, and the emergence of firearms for the development of amputation techniques. One might think that anesthesia would have developed alongside this progress. But no, strangely, interest of general anesthesia began to wane. Throughout the entire early modern period, there was no widespread use of general anesthesia even during the most painful operations. In some cases, traditional pain relief methods are mentioned: opium, mandrake, herbal inhalation mixtures, large doses of alcohol, but, as in the Middle Ages, their effectiveness and prevalence remain doubtful due to the lack of reliable evidence in sources. All the same, the idea that surgeons of the 16th, 18th centuries ignored pain is false. They were far from being cruel butchers and understood well that operations were painful. That is precisely why they constantly sought ways to ease the suffering of patients, refining instruments, making them thinner and more precise, and making the operations themselves as fast as possible. Their goal was simple and humane: to help and cause as little pain as possible. But the very idea of a medicated sleep, what we would today call general anesthesia, was and almost never considered as a real option. It is likely that surgeons clearly understood the psychoactive substances known to them either simply did not work strongly enough or were too dangerous to be used without risking the patient's life. Therefore, they preferred speed and skill over dubious drugs. They simply lacked a reliable tool, something that was only just beginning to emerge: chemistry. Without dwelling on the detailed development of surgical practices, let us move directly to one of the most common conditions that required surgical intervention at that time. Breast tumors were considered one of the most common forms of cancer, which is why numerous medical manuals described cancer as an exclusively female disease. According to the manuals, certain forms of the disease could be treated conservatively, while others required surgical intervention. For obvious reasons, due to fear of the scalpel, most women delayed seeking medical help and turned to doctors only when the tumors were already too large and painful to treat without surgery. Small tumors were cut out of the breast with a scalpel or, through an incision, were cauterized with caustics, corrosive chemicals, and often this was done over the course of several sessions. Severe forms of the disease required radical measures: mastectomy, the removal of the mammary gland, which was endured by the writer Fanny Burney. The few surviving accounts from surgeons of such operations were preserved mainly because of astonishment at the exceptional endurance of certain patients. Some women underwent surgery motionless and silent, showing remarkable resilience. This sharply contrasted with the widespread notion of women as delicate beings, overly sensitive and with a lower pain threshold than men. At the same time, such accounts show how clearly surgeons understood the scale of suffering caused by such procedures. One English surgeon who operated on numerous tumors in an elderly patient admitted that he would rather die than endure such treatment on his own body. Her breast was repeatedly cut open to remove growths. Sometimes wounds had to be reopened to remove affected tissues. The patient endured it all without a single cry or sigh. Paradoxically, while Western surgeons regarded pain during operations as inevitable, sometimes even as necessary, and focused on working quickly, on the other side of the world, in isolated Japan, the physician Hanaoka Seishū spent decades searching for anesthesia. Inspired by an ancient story of the Chinese healer Hua Tuo and his Maffei son, a potion that plunged the patient into sleep, he became the first Japanese surgeon to perform a complex operation under anesthesia. Hanaoka Seishū combined traditional Chinese medicine with elements of European surgery, which at the time remained prohibited in Japan. This knowledge entered the isolated country mainly illegally, through Dutch sailors, Japan's only channel of contact with the West. Alongside surgical innovations, Hanaoka sought to ease the suffering of patients during operations. Since none of the medical traditions from which he drew his knowledge contained reliable information about anesthesia, he set out to develop an effective anesthetic on his own, literally from scratch. Starting in 1785, Hanaoka experimented with combinations of psychoactive plants. At first, he focused on the datura flower, known for its ability to cause unconsciousness when ingested, and later added new ingredients to the mixture. Hanaoka first tested his remedy on animals, and once convinced of its effectiveness, looked for volunteers for human trials. His wife and mother agreed. The trials were not without complications. His wife lost her sight, and his mother was severely poisoned and soon died. In 1804, almost 20 years after starting his experiments, Hanaoka announced the creation of an effective anesthetic called Susensan and performed the first reliably documented operation in history under general anesthesia. His patient was a 60-year-old woman named Ayakan who suffered from a painful tumor in her mammary gland. After drinking the liquid remedy, she fell into a deep sleep within a few hours, allowing Hanaoka to remove the growth without hindrance. The patient successfully survived the operation, and the effects of the anesthesia passed without any complications. This success attracted wide interest, and soon hundreds of patients began to seek Hanaoka Seishū's help. Using the Susensan he had created, he performed tumor resections, removed bladder stones, and amputated limbs. Until his death in 1835, Hanaoka carried out more than 150 operations for breast cancer. The Susensan mixture consisted of extracts of several psychoactive and medicinal plants in carefully measured proportions. 8 parts datura, 2 parts each of angelica, aconite, pinellia, lowage, donkey, and 1 part erythema. The mixture was ground into a paste, boiled in water and given to drink. After a few hours, the patient lost consciousness and, depending on the dose, remained unconscious from 6 to 24 hours. Far to the west, Fanny Burney and other unfortunate patients with breast tumors, as well as their surgeons, had no idea that such a breakthrough existed. Japan at the time remained a self-isolated state, deliberately limiting any exchange of knowledge with the outside world and carefully guarding its medical practices from foreign eyes. Nevertheless, the skilled surgeons who operated on Fanny managed to save her from complications and extended her life by another 29 years. She died in 1840 at the venerable age of 87. Ironically, one of the doctors who took part in Fanny's operation could, after a grueling day, find himself at a party where guests for entertainment inhaled nitrous oxide. This intoxicating, euphoric, surprisingly safe compound, known as laughing gas, caused temporary loss of sensation, yet for many years it would not occur to anyone to use synthetic gases for general anesthesia. Yet the blessed days of surgery under anesthesia were already on the horizon, and a few ambitious and controversial figures would soon usher a new era of anesthesiology with their experiments. But that is a subject for another long story. Next time you or someone close to you experiences the miracle of modern anesthesia, remember the centuries of suffering that preceded it. The journey from the agonies of the past and the painless procedures of today is one of the greatest triumphs in the history of medicine.